All right, well, Bernie Sanders has come out talking about his campaign, saying, quote, "What this campaign is about and what our administration will be about is making sure that all our people in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world can live with security and dignity. And that's not asking too much," end quote. Now, first of all, referring to the U.S. as the wealthiest nation in the world is something Bernie Sanders has done quite often. Now, does he ever stop and wonder why that is? Does he ever contemplate the fact that it was not his ideology that brought about that wealth? Now, there are tons of complaints I have about the U.S. and the stupidity of our government, but in relative terms, that's very important, relative to much of the world throughout history, we've been far more free market oriented with a respect for private property and the private ownership of the means of production, and we have a healthy profit motive. Again, we've been far, far from perfect in this regard, but in relative historical terms, we've done quite well with this. That is where our wealth comes from. That is why the poor in the U.S. do not live in abject poverty by the standards of much of the world and much of the history of the world. It's all about that little thought experiment. Would you rather be a filthy rich person living 150 years ago or a middle-class person in the U.S. today? I would take a middle-class person in the U.S. in 2020 any day of the week. If you're a filthy rich person 150 years ago, if it's mid-July and it's 90 degrees out, you're sweating and squirming just like everyone else. It doesn't matter how much gold you've got. 150 years ago, you want to communicate with someone halfway across the world, expect to wait a long time to hear a response, if you hear a response at all. Again, doesn't matter what you own or what your bank account looks like back then, you are in the thick of it just like everyone else. But not today. You could be in the lower to middle class in the U.S. in 2020 and enjoy a 68-degree home in the middle of July. And you can talk face-to-face with someone you know in New Zealand nearly instantaneously. We didn't get that way through legislation. It wasn't politicians writing the correct words down on pieces of paper to maneuver society and resources to make that all happen. It was not politicians campaigning on promises for instantaneous communication across the planet and then implementing that plan and experiencing a wild amount of success with that plan. It was the price system and the relatively free flow of capital investment and talent and that greedy search for profit in new markets, new technologies, and new industries. This is where wealth comes from. Doing market research. What do people want? Can we invest in research and development to make this happen? So when Bernie Sanders talks about the U.S. being the wealthiest nation on the planet, it strikes me as very odd and somewhat sad that he and his supporters are unable to think through this logically. We did not get this way by their mode of statist thinking. It was the complete opposite. And yeah, by the way, if you are a wealthy country, for a limited amount of time you can afford to throw money around irresponsibly and in ways that a free market and free people would not throw money around. You can overindulge and chip away at the wealth created by private investment and have a feel-good party for a short time, but that will come to an end. You can only misallocate resources so much before markets become so distorted and so unchained from what individual people would have otherwise done before people wake up and realize that the government has deployed resources in a way that is completely unhelpful, wasteful, and inefficient. Sweden learned this lesson too, although it seems they forgot. But because Bernie Sanders always mentions Sweden, I think it's appropriate for me to point out that they were a dirt-poor country, and they instituted free market reforms and became wildly capitalistic in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that's what caused them to go from complete destitution to wealth beyond their wildest dreams with a standard of living for everyone that skyrocketed. But if Sanders and his supporters insist on going down this dead-end road, well, prepare for people to eventually become disillusioned with the regime and demand some respect for private property, and maybe even demand to be left alone from his plans or the government's plans. And then the bloodshed, of course, starts, as it always does with this nonsense, and this is where Bernie Sanders' last sentence here comes into play. He says that this is not asking for much. Well, that's a falsehood. He isn't asking for anything. He might not say it, but it's as obvious as the sun that he intends to use direct government force, threats, and violence to implement his plan for this utopia of his. He's not asking, he's telling. And if you don't want to be a part of it, if maybe perhaps you insist on only dealing with people you'd voluntarily like to deal with, and only pay people who you enter into contracts with voluntarily, well, if history has anything to teach us, it certainly is not that government will do their best to try and convince you through logic, reasoning, and argument. No, they'll just hold a gun to your head and tell you to fall in line. And if you still insist on living your own life, well, they'll pull that trigger. They've done it hundreds of millions of times. That is the nature of government. Nonsense, violence, incompetence, all wrapped up in nice sounding promises of some utopia that never seems to come. But that is all for now. Please like and subscribe, and take it easy.